Now all men know of the binding of Fenris Wolf, how the great wolf was bound with a thread no thicker than a hair, made by the dwarfs skillfully, and how the great god Tyr placed his right hand, his sword hand, in the wolf's mouth, where it was savaged by the betrayal, for it was Tyr who had fed and raised him. And Tyr looked at the mangled ruin of what had been the finest sword hand in Asgard, and clumsily, wrong-handedly, drew his sword from its scabbard and cut that hand off at the wrist. And his blood ran upon the stones and down the rainbow bridge into earth. And this I tell you, if you find a green stone splotched with red, it is a sacred thing, for that is the blood of Tyr. And the gods feared that he would die. And he just stood and bled upon the stones. And finally, Loki of all people, pulled a torch from the wall and held it out, pleadingly, with tears catching in his russet beard. And Tyr thrust the stump of his hand into that fire and seared it. And he went into his hall and closed the door. There was no joy in Asgard that night, for they did not know if Tyr would live or die. 3 days he lay in his house, tended in turn by Frigg and Freya, and they would come out and shake their heads, they did not know. But at length, after a week, Tyr came forth, but he was changed forever. His hair, which had been golden as the sun, was now as silver as the blade of his sword. And his face had been merry, and now it was lined. The only thing remaining were his eyes that were deep green like the pines. And he spoke no word to anyone, and they respected him and gave him room. And one day he went to the forge of Volund Smith, who, as you know, flew to Asgard on wings of his own making, where he is a god for craftsmen of all kinds, and especially blacksmiths. And when he saw Tyr come in, he said, "How may I aid you, my lord Tyr?" And Tyr said, "Nay, Volund, call me not lord. You are the craftsman, and the craftsman is always lord in his own hall. I have come to beg a favor. If there is something I can do, Volund, can you make me a hand?" And Volund thought. And he thought a long while, and all the while, unconsciously, his hands moved the iron in the fire that it not burn. And at length he said, "A hand of metal I can make you easily enough, a hand to grip and hold. But give it the skill your lost hand had, I cannot do, and you would never be satisfied. It would not be good enough." And Tyr shook his head and said, "Volund, thank you. You have done me a service. It was my pride that spoke and not my wits." He went back to his hall. But Volund was not satisfied. And he thought, and he thought, and he thought some more. And at length he sent for Loki, because he does not go out over much, as you know, as he's lame. And Loki can go anywhere. And they talked into the night over a horn of mead, and Loki went out on an errand for Volund. And after 3 days he returned with something wrapped up, and gave it to Volund, and Volund shut himself in his smithy, and for 3 days he worked, and he forged, and he graved, and he made something. And when it was finished, he was satisfied, and he laid it in a casket of fine wood, wrapped in cloths of silk, and gave it to a Valkyrie to take to the house of Tyr. And she went to the house of Tyr, and he opened the door, and took the casket from her, and wondered what it could be. And he set it on a table in his hall, and opened it, and took out a silver armband, closed across the wrist, and reaching to the elbow, and carved all around it in figures so real they seemed to move and breathe, was the story of Tyr and Fenris Wolf. But there were also pictures of Tyr practicing left-handed with the sword, and standing at Ragnarok with his left hand holding the sword and in triumph killing his foes. And the last space of all was blank, because Voland is very wise. And Tyr put the armband on, and it fit like a second skin. No chafing, no running. He looked at it. And he knew that no one could see that armband and not think of the story of Fenris Wolf. But he also knew what Voland had tried to tell him in that last blank space. And he threw back his head and he laughed. And his laughter rang in the rafters of his hall that had heard no laughter for many weeks. And he went out into the garden to practice with the sword, because he had learned the lesson Voland sought to teach him. No matter how grim your circumstance, no matter if it is life or death, there is always hope.